Okay, so let's talk about Scheffler. Um, last week in the videos I did about the article critique form, I think one of the things I said was, very often you will not get a statement from a writer that says, my thesis is. Well, although interestingly enough, Reimer, who we'll talk about in relation to Acts 15, actually does say that. My thesis is. And so that should be very helpful for you in identifying the thesis statement. Um, Scheffler is not much different because he says on page 2, which is page 132 with the enumeration, I'm pointing over here to my iPad. He says this, in this article, I hope to indicate, and then he goes on. So here is a case where a writer is telling us his thesis and kind of sets out his agenda. It's not all that different than what Luke does in chapter 1, verse 8, at least for me. And I think many interpreters of the Bible think that what Luke is doing here in Acts 1:8 is pretty indicative of his thesis and the direction that he wants to go. But at the very least, in that particular statement in the Scheffler article, the case is made of what direction he wants to go, what his hope is, what his agenda is. One of the things I appreciate very much about the Scheffler article is this emphasis on the poor in Acts and how that can include everyone. And of course, we talked about everyone being welcome at the table, everybody getting a chance to play, right? In the last video. So I thought maybe, although I think there's a lot in the Scheffler article that I really appreciate, but I thought maybe to kind of highlight a one strength and one weaknesses, which is the same kind of thing I did with the Tida article last week. I thought that might be helpful. So here's a strength that I see in the Scheffler article. I really this writer really has good organizational skills, and I like the way at the bottom of page 132, which is page 2 in as you read it, and then the top of page 133 or page 3, there are these 7 categories of suffering and those who need care listed out there for us with some examples from the book of Acts. I just thought that organizationally that was very helpful. That makes it helpful to read it, as we've talked about that before, but it also sets out an agenda that then the writer can be measured against. Does he or she carry through on what they say they're going to do? But as with all articles, I think there's some weaknesses as well. I think that sometimes there are assumptions made about the text that seem to be, in my words, in my view, a little thin. Here's an example. Indicating that Luke's positive attitude toward widows in Acts 6 is the same as having a positive attitude toward women. Now, it is true that in Luke and in Acts, women play an enhanced role. And that is, we see women kind of leading, we see women being welcome at the table of leadership. We see women being close to Jesus and in ways that are not just dependent relationships. Of course, everyone, from a Christian theological point of view, everyone is dependent on Jesus. But I'm talking about the way the narrative works. It's not just that women are in either subservient or needy categories. Although there are some, but there are needy men too. So I'm not sure that, for example, portraying the widows in Acts 6 and their need is the same as saying that this is a positive attitude toward women. I think it's a positive attitude toward those who are in need, And Luke is emphasizing how the apostles continue the work of Jesus, and in both proclamation and in preservation. Okay, so by proclamation I mean preaching, and preservation I mean in providing help and sustenance for those who are in need. But is that making a case about the position of these widows as women, or is it making a case about the way the apostles regard the needy in a way that is not dependent on gender? So, the test case would be: are there places where men and their need are also treated in the book of Acts? And certainly that is the case as you read through it. There are offerings taken for the poor. There are men who are healed. There are examples throughout the book of Acts of non-gender specific care for the poor, which is, I think, what's going on in Acts chapter 6. Are the two equated? Now, at the same time, in the book of Acts, you have Paul interacting with a husband-wife team, Priscilla and Aquila, and she is regarded positively. You have Dorcas, a woman that is regarded positively for her leadership. You have Lydia, who's a seller of purple and kind of a prophetess. And then you have the daughters of Philip, 7 of them, who are prophetesses. Those, or female prophets would probably be better, those are examples to me of a really positive, strong endorsement of women and women's leadership. And that seems a little different than just talking about the need that is met in Acts chapter 6. I think the greater point is the apostles give attention to the meeting of physical needs. So that's just a concern I have, that the point that Scheffler's making there is just a little thin. That's how I read an article. I ask those kinds of questions. I see this is what the writer is saying. Is that necessarily the case? So then when I look at Scheffler, a little bit of a critique. While the author's categories of the marginalized in Acts is very helpful, what seems thin in this article is that explicit connectivity with compassion in the text. So if you remember from his thesis, he wants to talk about compassion, and he certainly talks about it from time to time, but he doesn't talk about it as regularly as I think he might. I think he may be expecting us, the readers, to make a connection that he doesn't make as clearly and as quickly himself. Do we assume then that the issue of compassion is important, or has the author demonstrated that the issue of compassion is important? And I'm not sure that he has made his case. I'm not saying compassion isn't there. I'm just saying I think the apostles, and the way the writer portrays them, is that they are fulfilling the works of Jesus, and that seems to be more important. They're following that pattern than it is that necessarily they are compassionate. They're compassionate, true, but following the model of Jesus seems to be more important to me. That's the way I read the text. You may agree with Scheffler about that. I have some questions. Now, the forays into biblical interpretation outside the boundaries of a conversation dominated by people of Western or European descent is extremely well taken. That's right at the end of the article. So he's reacting against kind of a Western male white hegemony on the interpretation of Scripture. My problem is that seems like a little bit of an afterthought, and it was like, and oh yeah, there's this. I would have liked for him to explore that a little bit more. So those are some critiques of Scheffler. But overall, I thought what he did in drawing attention to those categories of those needing help, and the way the apostles on time after time after time met those needs, and the connectivity with what Jesus did in the book of Luke. I thought just was masterful what he brought together there. So those are some thoughts about Scheffler. Maybe they help your thoughts.